It was a calm, sunny afternoon in Milwaukee, the kind that perfectly captured suburban life. Golden sunlight bathed the streets as kids raced their bikes down the sidewalk, laughter mingling with the rhythmic thud of a basketball on a driveway. A dog barked at a squirrel darting across a yard, its owner chuckling nearby. Birds flitted between trees, their cheerful songs blending with the steady hum of a lawnmower. On a porch, two teens swayed on a creaking swing, while a little girl knelt on the sidewalk, her chalk-dusted hands carefully crafting colorful flowers. Neighbors exchanged stories over a fence, their voices adding to the gentle rhythm of a neighborhood alive with connection and simplicity. Brandon Thompson, a 24-year-old with a quiet smile and an easygoing nature, had been walking along the familiar streets. His bike, a treasured gift from his late uncle, gleamed under the sunlight as it rolled beside him. The bike was more than just a mode of transportation. It was a memory of someone he loved and lost. Brandon, wearing a worn-out hoodie and jeans, paused near a corner where kids were playing hopscotch on the sidewalk. He watched them for a moment, his thoughts drifting. He liked this part of town. It wasn't fancy, but it had character, a mix of small houses and old trees, with neighbors who greeted each other on their porches. For Brandon, this bike ride was a moment of peace, a break from the challenges of living with a disability that often made simple things feel hard. But peace doesn't always last. From across the street, an older man approached. Robert McKinney, 67, had a sharp presence that made him hard to ignore. Tall and broad-shouldered, his gray hair and furrowed brow gave him an air of authority, the kind that could make people uneasy. His eyes narrowed as they locked on Marcus, and his steps quickened. "Hey, you!" Robert called out, his voice cutting through the warm air. Brandon froze, startled. Robert didn't hesitate. "That bike, where'd you get it? It looks just like one that went missing around here." Brandon blinked, confused. This is my bike," he stammered, his voice soft but steady. Robert wasn't listening. His words came fast, loud and heavy, like accusations flung without care. "You stole it, didn't you? I've seen you around here before. You don't belong here." The words hit Brandon like a slap. His heart started pounding, his palms sweaty as he gripped the handlebars of his bike tighter. "No, sir," Brandon said, trying to keep his voice calm. "This bike, it's mine. My uncle gave it to me." But Robert didn't seem to hear, or didn't want to. His presence was overwhelming, his frustration turning into something darker. The street that had felt so lively a moment ago now seemed eerily quiet. The laughter of children faded into the background. People nearby began to notice. A small group of neighbors turned their heads, curiosity drawing them closer. Among them was Lena Washington, a young woman who often walked these streets with her two kids. Her instincts kicked in as she sensed the confrontation escalating. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she hit the record button. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, her voice firm but uneasy. "What's going on here?" Robert ignored her. His attention was locked on Brandon, his face growing red with anger. "Don't lie to me," he shouted. Before Brandon could step back, Robert reached out, his hand wrapping tightly around Brandon's neck. The moment was terrifying. Brandon gasped, his voice choked as he struggled to pull away. His mind raced. Why was this happening? Why wouldn't Robert listen? Fear gripped him as he felt the pressure around his neck. "Let go of him!" Lena's voice rose, shaky but determined. She stepped closer, still recording. "You don't have to do this. Just let him go." The tension in the air was suffocating. Brandon's eyes darted around, looking for help, for anything that could end this nightmare. The small crowd began murmuring, some pulling out their phones, others shouting at Robert to stop. But Robert's grip stayed firm, his face a mask of anger and frustration. For Brandon, time seemed to slow down. His mind flashed back to simpler moments, his uncle smiling as he handed him the bike, telling him to ride it with pride. He thought of his mother's comforting words whenever life felt unfair, but now standing there gasping for air, he felt small and powerless. "Please," Lena begged again, stepping closer. "This isn't right. You're hurting him." Robert finally glanced at her, his expression unreadable. But he didn't release his grip. The scene felt frozen, each second stretching into eternity. Brandon's chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, his voice barely a whisper as he managed to say, "I didn't do anything." The weight of the moment hung heavy over everyone watching. Lena's camera captured it all, the raw fear in Brandon's eyes, the tight grip of Robert's hand, and the growing outrage in the voices of those around them. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something deeper, something uglier. The street that had once felt like a safe place for Brandon now felt like a trap. And for those watching, it was a scene that would haunt them long after the day ended. The video spread like wildfire. It started in a local Milwaukee Facebook group, posted by someone who had no idea how far it would go. But within hours, it was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, and even the evening news. The footage was grainy, but the fear on Brandon's face was painfully clear. His hands clawed at Robert's grip, his eyes wide with panic. Lena's voice, shaky but growing louder, filled the background. "Let him go," she repeated, her words rising above the murmurs of the small crowd gathering on the street. People couldn't look away. The image of Robert's hand gripping Brandon's neck stayed with everyone who watched it. It was raw and uncomfortable, the kind of thing that made you stop scrolling and sit with the weight of what you'd just seen. The reaction was immediate. Phones buzzed with notifications as people shared the video. Comments poured in by the thousands. Some were filled with anger. How could this happen in 2025? Others offered support for Brandon. "Stay strong, young man. We see you." But not everyone agreed. A few defended Robert, insisting he was just protecting the neighborhood. "We don't know the full story," one person wrote. "What if the kid really did steal the bike?" At home, Brandon's mother, Angela Thompson, sat in her small living room, her phone lighting up with calls and messages. She was a schoolteacher, a woman used to solving problems with calm words and steady hands. But now her heart was breaking. She had watched the video only once, and that was enough. Seeing her son like that, scared and helpless, was a kind of pain she hadn't been prepared for. When reporters showed up at her door, Angela wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. She stepped outside, her voice trembling but firm. "My son is gentle. He wouldn't hurt anyone," she told them, holding back tears. "This wasn't about a bike. This was about seeing my son's skin color first." Her words hit like a thunderclap, resonating with parents who couldn't help but imagine their own children in Brandon's place. Meanwhile, Brandon tried to process what had happened. He sat on the edge of his bed staring at the floor. His cousin, Jamal Banks, sat beside him, quiet but close. "I thought he was going to hurt me," Brandon finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't get the image of Robert's face out of his mind. The anger, the way he looked at him like he wasn't even a person. Jamal nodded, his jaw tight. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said, but the words felt hollow. They both knew that sometimes doing nothing wrong wasn't enough. Across Milwaukee, the city was buzzing. People gathered outside the Milwaukee County Courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for Brandon and End Racial Violence." The protests started small, a few dozen people standing together in the cold, their voices echoing off the stone walls of the courthouse. But by the next day, the crowd had doubled, then tripled. Civil rights groups like the Milwaukee Alliance for Justice joined in, calling for accountability and an end to racial profiling. The protests were peaceful, but filled with emotion. People shared stories of their own experiences, their voices shaking with anger and sadness. A young woman stood on the courthouse steps, tears streaming down her face as she held a sign that said, "That could have been my brother." Not everyone supported the movement. On social media and in private conversations, some defended Robert's actions. "He was just trying to protect the neighborhood," one man said in an interview. "If he thought the bike was stolen, what was he supposed to do? Just let it go?" The words stung for those who knew Brandon. They knew the truth, but now it felt like they had to prove it to the world. Brandon tried to avoid the news, but it was impossible to escape. The video played on every channel, each time dragging him back to that moment. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the weight of Robert's hand around his neck. He heard Lena's voice pleading, the murmurs of the crowd, the sound of his own breath coming short and fast. Angela noticed the change in him. He was quieter now, his usual easy smile replaced by a look of worry that didn't seem to go away. One evening, she sat beside him on the couch, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "You're stronger than you think," she told him. We're going to get through this. Brandon nodded, but the weight of what had happened stayed heavy in his chest. The city was reacting, the world was watching, but he still felt alone in his thoughts. As the protests grew louder and the conversations online got more heated, Brandon and his family waited for answers, for justice, and for a way to move forward. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people filled the wooden benches. The walls were plain and gray, but the tension in the room made everything feel heavier, like the air itself was pressing down. Robert McKinney, dressed in a dark suit that hung awkwardly on his broad frame, sat next to his attorney, John Hargrove. His face was stiff, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't glance at the audience. He kept his eyes on the table in front of him, his hands folded tightly together. Brandon Thompson sat across the room, flanked by his mother, Angela, and cousin Jamal. Brandon fidgeted, his hands resting nervously in his lap. He wore a simple button-down shirt, but no matter how he dressed, he felt out of place. This wasn't where he wanted to be. He glanced around, his eyes landing on Robert for a moment before quickly looking away. The memory of that day, the anger in Robert's eyes, the tight grip around his neck, was still fresh, like it had just happened. John Hargrove rose to speak. He was a tall man with a sharp voice that carried through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, pacing slowly, "this is not a case about race. This is a case about a concerned citizen trying to protect his community." Angela's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She reached over and squeezed Brandon's hand. Brandon didn't look at her, but she felt him grip her fingers tightly, like he needed an anchor to keep him steady. The prosecutor, a shorter woman with a calm but firm demeanor, stood up next. She moved deliberately, holding a stack of papers in her hands. "This case," she said, her voice steady, "is about something deeper. It's about prejudice. It's about a man assuming guilt based on nothing more than appearance." Her words hung in the air, making the room feel even smaller. The first witness was called. Brandon. The room grew still as he walked to the stand. His steps were hesitant and his breathing was shallow. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, the weight of their expectations pressing against his shoulders. When he sat down, the chair felt too big, too stiff. The judge asked him to state his name, and his voice came out softer than he intended. "Brandon Thompson," he said, clearing his throat nervously. The prosecutor approached him, her expression kind but serious. "Brandon," she said gently, "can you tell us what happened on the day in question?" He nodded slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the stand. I was walking with my bike," he began, his voice trembling. "It's my uncle's bike. He gave it to me before he passed." He paused, swallowing hard. "And then this man," he glanced at Robert but quickly looked away. "He came up to me and started yelling." "What did he say?" the prosecutor asked. Brandon hesitated, his brow furrowing as he tried to find the right words. "He said I stole the bike, but I didn't. It's mine." His voice cracked slightly and he paused to steady himself. "Then he grabbed me by the neck. I couldn't breathe." The room was silent except for the soft rustling of papers. Angela wiped at her eyes with a tissue, her lips pressed tightly together as she listened. Jamal leaned forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "Did you try to explain to him?" the prosecutor asked. "I did," Brandon said, his voice growing a little stronger now. "I told him it was mine. I told him my uncle gave it to me, but he wouldn't listen. He just kept holding on." The prosecutor nodded and stepped back. "Thank you, Brandon." She turned to the judge. "I'd like to present Exhibit A, the video of the incident." The screen in the courtroom lit up, and the video began to play. The room was quiet except for the sound of the recording. Lena's voice pleading, Brandon gasping, the faint murmurs of the crowd. The footage was shaky, but it was clear enough. The image of Robert's hand gripping Brandon's neck made several people in the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. When the video ended, the room remained silent. The prosecutor turned to Robert. "Do you deny this is you in the video, Mr. McKinney?" Robert's attorney, John Hargrove, quickly stood. "Objection, Your Honor," he said. "The video doesn't show the full context of the situation." The judge nodded but looked unimpressed. "Overruled. Continue." When Angela was called to the stand, Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she held them in her lap. She looked directly at Robert as she spoke. "You saw my son as a thief before you saw him as a person," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You didn't see his heart, his story, his struggles. You just saw what you wanted to see." The courtroom felt heavier after her testimony. Even Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting to the floor. The day's proceedings ended, but the tension in the room lingered long after everyone had left. The courtroom was quiet as the judge returned to deliver the verdict. The sound of papers rustling echoed faintly through the room. Everyone held their breath. Brandon sat with his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his mother Angela beside him, her gaze fixed on the judge with a mixture of hope and worry. Robert McKinney sat across the room, his expression unreadable, but his attorney shifted nervously in his seat. "Robert McKinney," the judge began, her voice firm yet calm, "you have been found guilty of disorderly conduct." For a moment it felt like the entire room exhaled at once, but the relief was short-lived. The judge continued, "You are sentenced to community service and a fine of $100,000. The words hung in the air, heavy and deflating. Angela's mouth tightened, and her eyes filled with tears, though she didn't let them fall. She reached for Brando's hand, squeezing it tightly. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the floor. The punishment felt so small compared to what he had endured. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. People whispered to one another, their voices tinged with disbelief and frustration. Some were satisfied that Robert had been found guilty at all, while others felt the sentence was an insult, a slap on the wrist for an act that had left deep emotional wounds. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was just as charged. Protesters gathered, holding their signs high, their voices rising in unison. The words "Justice for Brandon" and "End Racial Violence" echoed through the streets. Angela and Brandon walked past the crowd, their steps slow and heavy. Reporters rushed forward, microphones thrust in their faces, cameras flashing. "How do you feel about the verdict?" one of them asked. Angela stopped and turned to face the cameras, her voice calm but firm. "It's not enough," she said simply, "but it's a start." For Brandon, the fight was far from over. The days after the verdict were filled with a quiet kind of pain. The incident replayed in his mind over and over, especially at night when everything was still. He'd close his eyes and the memory of Robert's hand around his neck would come rushing back, his chest tightening as if it were happening all over again. Angela watched her son struggle and knew she had to do something. She encouraged him to see a therapist, someone who could help him process what had happened. At first, Brandon was hesitant. He didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to relive it. But Angela's gentle persistence won out. In therapy, Brandon found a space to let go of the anger and fear he had been carrying. He talked about the humiliation he felt, the way Robert had looked at him like he was less than human. He talked about the way people had whispered about him afterward, some offering support, others questioning his innocence. Slowly he began to heal, though the scars, both emotional and physical, would take time to fade. With his mother's encouragement, Brandon started speaking at local schools and community centers. He shared his story with kids and teenagers, his voice steady but full of emotion. He told them about the bike his uncle had given him, about the joy it brought him, and how that joy had been ripped away in a single moment. He talked about the fear he felt and the strength he found in his family and community. "Don't let anyone make you feel small," he would tell them. "You matter. Your story matters." At one rally, standing in front of a crowd holding signs of support, Angela spoke too. Her voice was strong, full of determination. "We can't let hate win," she said, looking out at the sea of faces. "We have to fight for each other, for justice, for change. We owe it to our children, to our future." The words resonated deeply with those who listened. The crowd cheered, their voices merging into one loud, powerful sound. It wasn't just about Brandon anymore. His story had become a symbol, a reminder of the work that still needed to be done to fight prejudice and create a world where everyone could feel safe. The video of the rally was shared widely, drawing even more attention to Brandon's story. People from across the country reached out, offering words of support and solidarity. Some shared their own experiences, stories of moments when they too had been judged unfairly.